Alright, so here is the information on connective tissue. Connective tissue is very, very diverse in terms of its properties and functions. In fact, it's so diverse that if I actually put the three examples that we're ready to list next to each other, you probably wouldn't even think that they were related at all, but they are. So the three main examples of connective tissue include blood, bone, and fat. Now, on the surface, they may not look the same, but if you actually look at the structure of the tissue, they are, because they share three basic parts, and that includes specialized cells, protein fibers, and a fluid that combines with the fibers, which is called a ground substance. Now, when this fluid, the ground substance, and the protein fibers combine, it forms something called the matrix. And the matrix actually makes up most of the volume of connective tissue. So when we actually look at connective tissue, most of what we're actually looking at is this combination. It's not actually cells. Connective tissue also has some basic functions that it shares: support and protection, transportation of materials. So support and protection you can definitely see with bone. Transportation you can definitely see with blood. Energy storage, like in fat. And defense of the body, which is part of the immune function of the blood. Now, connective tissue is broken down first into three major types, and this is based on the physical properties of the matrix. This includes connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supporting connective tissue. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through all three types and look at any of the subtypes and really kind of look at the cells that are present, the proteins that are present, and kind of describe it. So the first one we're going to talk about is connective tissue proper. This type has a lot of different cell types as well as a wide variety of fibers. The ground substance that is present is very syrupy, almost like a maple syrup or a corn syrup. Examples of connective tissue proper are like the tissue underneath our skin, fatty tissue, tendons, and ligaments. All right, so let's go through the 5 different types of cells that we have in connective tissue proper. The first type are the fibroblasts. These are the most abundant type of cell that we find in connective tissue proper, and they are responsible for producing the fibers as well as the ground substance that we find. The second type are the fibrocytes. These are the next highest in abundance. These are actually made from fibroblasts. Fibroblasts every so often will undergo a maturation process, and when they mature, they become a fibrocyte. We will see this kind of pattern repeating throughout anatomy and physiology, where we have an immature form of a cell that we refer to as a blast with that suffix, and then the mature form is actually a cyte. So the way I kind of remember it is blast means baby. So to me, fibroblast is a baby fibrocell. Or, for instance, osteoblast, that's a baby bone cell, whereas the osteocyte or the fibrocyte is the mature one. Now, not all fibroblasts become fibrocytes. Many of them stay fibroblasts their entire lives just because their job in terms of producing the fibers and the ground substance is so important. Now, the fibrocytes, once they mature from a fibroblast, they no longer perform this function. Their job then is to maintain the tissue fibers that the fibroblasts create. The third type are the macrophages. These are what we call the big eaters. Macro means big, and phage, like from phagocytosis, means to eat. These are scattered throughout the matrix, and what they do is they use that process of phagocytosis, like from their name, to eliminate both damaged cells as well as pathogens that may be present. They release chemicals that help to mobilize the immune system. So in other words, if there's something there that shouldn't be there or is damaging the cells, it helps kind of call in the immune system to actually fight whatever is there. The fourth type of cell are the fat cells. These are sometimes called adipose cells or adipocytes. Mostly these are filled with lipid. And these, in fact, are so packed with lipid that when we actually look at them under a microscope, it looks like the cells are actually empty. What is happening is because there's so much lipid present, the nucleus and the other organelles actually get squeezed to one side of the cell. The last type of cell in connective tissue proper are the mast cells. And the mast cells are very small, mobile cells that are found near blood vessels. And their job is to kind of help get do the initial immune response. So after injury or infection, they actually start that body's defense mechanism. They can actually signal into the blood vessels for the body's defenses to come to that particular site. So those are the 5 types of cells that are found in different combinations within the different types of connective tissue proper. We also have 3 different types of fibers that we're going to look at. The first one are the collagen fibers. These are long, straight, and unbranched fibers that are very flexible. In addition, they are the most common type of fiber that is present within connective tissue proper. The second type are called elastic fibers, and just like their name implies, they are elastic. Think of like elastic in clothing. They're capable of stretching and then returning to the original length. They contain a protein that allows them to do this called elastin. Now, unlike collagen fibers, which are straight, just like a straight line, these are branched, more like a tree, and the fibers are actually wavy, so they have a little bit of curl to them. And like I said, because we call them elastic, they do have that property of returning to their original length after they have been stretched. The last type of fiber are the reticular fibers. These are the least common in connective tissue proper, and they are thinner than the collagen fibers. They form a branching, interwoven web of fibers. So we've got the straight fibers of collagen, we have the tree-like fibers of elastic, and in the reticular fibers we have this web. Kind of think like a spider web. So they are different not only in how they appear, but how they are arranged. Now within connective tissue proper, so we've talked about the cells, now we've talked about the fibers, we need to talk about the ground substance. This ground substance is actually what fills the spaces between the cells and surrounds the fibers. The ground substance in connective tissue proper is clear and colorless, but it has a thicker consistency than water. It's more like a maple syrup. This is important for slowing the bacteria and pathogen movement into the tissue. It's kind of like the difference between swimming in water and swimming in caramel. You're actually going to swim a lot faster, obviously, in a pool if it was filled with water versus caramel. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these different components and actually see how what is present determines the type of connective tissue proper that we have. The first type is loose connective tissue. These are the body's packing peanuts. They fill the space between organs, so the tissue that lies in between our organs is loose connective tissue. It helps to provide cushioning as well as support the epithelia. It helps to anchor our blood vessels in place as well as any nerves that go off of our spinal cord. It also stores lipids. In addition, loose connective tissue allows diffusion of materials to the areas where they are. It is also the least specialized. So as you can see, there's a lot of different functions that are taking place here. And that's just because it's just kind of the general type of connective tissue that is present. It also has a very extensive blood supply. If you end up with a cut into this area, it tends to bleed a lot. Examples of loose connective tissue are the tissue that lies between your skin but on top of your muscles, as well as adipose or fat tissue. So let's take here a look at one of the diagrams here of loose connective tissue. You can see here we've got, especially if you look at the drawn one, we've got the different fibers. So here we have this like thin one, that is an elastic fiber, and you can see it's kind of branched, it's bent. The collagen fiber is here, it's kind of straight. Okay, the big orange or yellow thing is the fat cell, the adipose site, and notice on the microscope slide image it actually comes through as clear. That's because the fat doesn't stain. We have a little macrophage here, and we have a bunch of fibroblasts. So, and then of course a mast cell. So we have a lot of the different types here, but it's kind of a mishmash, and that's because it's so generalized. We don't have one predominant type of cell here. The other type of loose connective tissue is dominated by one type of cell, and that's the adipose tissue. Mostly what it is made up of is adipocytes, because it's mostly fat tissue. The second type of connective tissue proper is dense connective tissue. This type of connective tissue is very tough, very strong, and very durable. It tends to resist distortion. It also connects our bones and muscles to each other, so bone to bone and muscle to bone. Dense connective tissue is used to form capsules, which cover our organs as well as enclose our joint cavities. Now it does have a lot of different types of cells present, but the type of fiber which is present here is kind of important. It's mostly collagen. And we have two subtypes. The first one is our dense regular connective tissue. The difference between dense regular and dense irregular has to do with the fibers. The fibers in dense regular are laid parallel. So in other words, it's not that they're perfectly straight, it's just that they don't crisscross each other. In addition, they are tightly packed. So examples of dense regular include our tendons, which work to attach our skeletal muscle to bones, and our ligaments, which connect the bones to each other. Now, contrasting that with dense irregular connective tissue, we have an interwoven mesh of collagen. So the fibers are not laid parallel to each other. This type of connective tissue is actually what gives the skin its strength because of this arrangement of the dense irregular tissue. But the diagram that we give to you here actually is showing dense regular, because if you look over here, it's pulling it from where the muscle is actually getting attached to the bone. This is a tendon. All right, and you can see here the collagen fibers aren't completely straight like a line, but I can follow one from the top all the way down to the bottom, so they don't crisscross or crosshatch each other. So those are the two main types of connective tissue proper. So the second type of connective tissue we have is fluid connective tissue. This is what forms most of the fluid that we have in the body that's not contained within cells, and that's called extracellular fluid. There are, however, very distinct cells that are present within fluid connective tissue. But the matrix is very liquid and very watery. It doesn't even have that maple syrup consistency that we talked about before. We have three main types of fluid connective tissue, two of which we will definitely talk about a lot within two of our body system units. The first one is one of those, that is the blood. In the blood, the cells are our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. Those are the specialized cells. Each one of them has their own function, and they look very different from each other. The matrix is the plasma. That is our liquid portion of the blood that we have. The second type of fluid connective tissue is interstitial fluid. This is what is created at the capillary level. As the blood moves through the capillaries, some of the fluid portion of the blood, mostly water and some small solutes, actually gets squeezed out. It's kind of like wringing out a sponge. You get most of the stuff, most of the water out of a sponge when you do that, but you don't get it all. This is the fluid that actually surrounds our body cells. And this is important because this is how dissolved nutrients like oxygen and glucose actually get delivered to the cells for the cells to use. Now that interstitial fluid, some of it does go back into the bloodstream there at the capillary, but not all of it does. Some of it actually moves into a specialized vessel and then changes its name to lymph. Okay, this is formed when the interstitial fluid enters the lymphatic vessels, which are part of the lymphatic system that we will talk about later in the semester. What this does is it returns this fluid back to the cardiovascular system, so it gets back into and joined back up with the blood. Now, as it's returning back to the cardiovascular system, it actually gets filtered and monitored by the immune system to look for signs of injury or infection. because if injury or infection has taken place, the cells will actually release chemical messengers that the immune system can pick up on within that interstitial fluid. The last type of connective tissue is our supporting connective tissue, and we have two main types of supporting connective tissue, bone and cartilage. We're going to talk about cartilage first. Cartilage has a matrix that's made up of a firm gel as well as fibers. If you think of cartilage, what you're actually thinking of, that kind of spongy material, that is actually the matrix that we think of. The cells within the matrix are called chondrocytes, and they live in little pockets of this gel that are called lacunae. Cartilage has absolutely no blood supply, and this very much limits its ability to repair itself after it's been damaged. In addition, cartilage tissue is separated from any surrounding tissue by a lining called the perichondrium. Now we have three major types of cartilage in the body. The first one is hyaline cartilage, and this is the most common type of cartilage that we have. Within cartilage, we have very closely packed collagen fibers that make this type of cartilage very tough and but still flexible. For example, this is the type of cartilage that actually attaches our ribs to our breastbone. So it has to have some flexibility that allows the ribs to stretch and flex when we breathe. However, it can't be very easy to break. It has to be very, very tough because this happens over the course of our entire lifetime. Okay, and this is actually a diagram of the hyaline cartilage. The purple area is that matrix, that gel-like substance, and then the things that kind of look like little bugs with the dots, those are actually the chondrocytes. Those are the little colonies of cells that live within the matrix. The second type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. And again, given the name, you know the type of fiber that is present here. This is mostly elastic fibers. So this type of cartilage is much more flexible than hyaline cartilage, and an example of elastic cartilage would be your outer ear. And as you can see on the diagram, it looks very, very different. Because it's got elastic fibers, you can actually see the fibers much more easily than you can with the hyaline cartilage. The cells are still present within the matrix, but it definitely has a much different appearance. The third type is the fibrous cartilage. This type of cartilage has very little fluid, so we have very little ground substance associated with this type of cartilage. But we have lots of interwoven collagen fibers that make a mesh. This type of cartilage is very durable and tough, and we find it in places that need to have that type of durability. For instance, the cartilage pads that are located in between our vertebrae. These are what cushion our vertebrae as we move and bend, so that the bones actually don't touch each other and damage each other as they with the friction that they would create. And you can see here that the picture looks very, very different. Now, part of it's a different dye. However, you can actually see the collagen fibers, whereas in hyaline cartilage, even though it had collagen, because of the amount of liquid there, you couldn't actually see them. These are also, because they're interwoven, it's easier to see them. Now the chondrocytes kind of look like the eyeball things here. This is the chondrocyte, kind of looks like the iris part and the pupil, and then this white portion is the lacuna, where they actually exist. So this is where they are actually able to kind of live within that matrix area. Now let's contrast cartilage with bone. Now, compared to cartilage, the volume of ground substance in bone is very small. And that actually makes some sense, because when you think of bone tissue, you don't think of anything that has any liquid really involved with it at all. The matrix is what typically we think of when we think of bone. Very hard calcium deposits, as well as some collagen fibers, although we don't tend to think of collagen with bone. Within the bone, we still have those lacunae, and in them, they have the bone cells, the osteocytes. In addition, because there is the calcium deposits that are present in the matrix are impermeable. In order for diffusion to happen, we need little pathways for that to occur, and that is the canaliculi. These are little canals that allow the cytoplasmic extensions of the osteocytes to work near the blood vessels. It also allows materials from the blood vessels to actually diffuse to the cells themselves. On the outer layer covering of bone, you have a periosteum, which includes a fibrous layer as well as a cell layer. So here on the diagram, the center part everybody always thinks is actually the osteocytes, but these are actually the little black dots that you see here on the slide. If you look over at the drawing version, you can see there's a bunch of little cracks, and if you look over on the light microscope image, you notice you can see those too. Those are the canaliculi. Those are those little canals where the fluid and the diffusion actually takes place. Now, because bone and cartilage are so closely related, and we typically associate them with each other, I want to take a minute to actually compare them. So the first characteristic that we're going to compare are the cells. In cartilage, we have chondrocytes that exist in little pools called lacunae. And in bone, we also have lacunae, but their cells are called osteocytes. So anytime we have this term chondro, we're referring to cartilage. Anytime we have the term osteo, it is referring to bone. Ground substance. The cartilage has gel and fibers, whereas the bone has very little liquid compared to cartilage and calcium salts. For the fibers, cartilage has all three types of fibers that are present, whereas bone has mostly collagen fibers that are present. With the blood supply, cartilage actually has absolutely no blood supply within it at all. Everything for cartilage has to actually diffuse all the way through the matrix to get to the cells. Bone, however, has a very extensive blood supply, and so its supply of nutrients and removal of waste, it takes place much, much easier. The covering of cartilage is called the perichondrium, and the covering of bone is called the periosteum. In terms of strength, cartilage is limited in its strength because it bends easily, but it is very difficult to break. To actually break it, you usually have to tear it. On the other hand, bone is very strong, but the trade-off is it doesn't bend. So obviously, we have some different characteristics of these that allow them to function better in certain places in the body than in others. Oxygen demands. Cartilage, because it doesn't have a good blood supply and nutrient availability, its oxygen demands are low, whereas bone has very high oxygen demands of its cells. Nutrient delivery. All nutrients for cartilage have to diffuse through the matrix, which is very difficult and slow. Bone has diffusion through the cytoplasm as well as the fluid in the canaliculi. So this is actually very fast, which allows them to have a higher metabolism and demand more oxygen. These two things also affect the ability for these two substances to repair themselves. Cartilage repairs are very, very limited. They can take an extremely long amount of time if they happen sometimes at all. Many times severe cartilage damage never will repair itself. That's why, for instance, if you get a meniscus tear, they have to go in and actually trim the meniscus because that will never fix itself. Bone, however, has a very extensive ability to repair itself. And that's because it gets a good nutrient supply because of the good blood vessel supply that it has. Now this brings us to our first condition that affects connective tissue. This is kind of our first disease, and that is Marfan Syndrome. This is a genetic disease where we have an abnormal form of fibrillin, which is a protein that is produced. Remember, genetic diseases, DNA, that is the code for making proteins. So the code for making this particular protein is incorrect. And having this incorrect protein affects the strength and elasticity of the connective tissue. And this is unfortunately very, very widespread because fibrillin is used in pretty much every single type of connective tissue throughout the body. This, however, can be very hard to diagnose. So the most visible sign and kind of giveaway is the skeleton. So if we look at the skeleton, some giveaways of people who have Marfan syndrome, they typically are extremely tall, with abnormally long hands, legs, and fingers, and arms. And they also exhibit great flexibility. Now, I can tell you from experience, being tall does not always mean that you are very flexible. So, it's kind of this combination of things. So why is this a problem? Well, what happens is it actually creates major consequences to the cardiovascular system, because some of the connective tissue actually lies within our blood vessels, within the circulatory system. It can actually weaken the walls, especially of our major arteries, like the aorta. It creates something called an aneurysm. If those, think of it like a weakened, almost like a balloon. It kind of stretches and stretches and stretches. It eventually can burst and pop. And with some of these major arteries, that means you can lose a lot of blood in a very little amount of time. If doctors aren't able to catch this in time, it can actually kill you. So this is a very dangerous and very serious condition. I'm going to show you a couple pictures here in a second of people who have Marfan syndrome, but every so often this crops up, and especially with the Olympics, whenever those come around. Michael Phelps is one person who people tend to think maybe has Marfan syndrome. He actually does not, but if you think of some of his characteristics, it makes kind of sense. His arm span, in other words, if he holds out his arms at his sides straight, from fingertip to fingertip, is about 9 feet. Now, Michael Phelps is not 9 feet tall, and typically that distance between fingertip to fingertip is how tall you are, or close, and his is way, way higher. In addition, if you look at his hands and his feet, they're a little bit out of proportion with the rest of his body. And his arms being so long and not in proportion, and his legs and his feet. So he has been tested, and he does not have Marfan syndrome. Now you can see in this picture, though, that these people actually do. And I chose this one because their hands are highlighted, and especially with this one here. I mean, you can see here with the little girl, her fingers are very, very long. But you can actually see here with the whole hand highlighted. This hand is just huge, whereas the rest of his body does not match that at all. His fingers are extraordinarily long. You can look at his father. His father is showing signs of this as well, and so is his younger brother and his younger sister. These are people who genetically have Marfan syndrome. Sometimes, in a little bit more modern picture, people with Marfan syndrome might look something like this. It does tend to strike men more than women, and because it is a sex-linked gene. So it is something that runs in families, and if you have a family history of anything like this, it can be something that you may want to get genetically tested for. So that wraps up our discussion of connective tissue, and in the next section we will actually be looking at membranes, because they are a combination of connective tissue and epithelial tissue.